She introduced me to her friends the way you'd introduce a stray dog that followed you home.
This is Raymond, my father-in-law. He's from Indiana.
The way she said, Indiana, like it explained everything, like it was a diagnosis. I kept eating my salad. I didn't know which fork to use, so I used the one that looked right to me. Turned out it wasn't the right one. I found that out later, from the look on her face when she thought I wasn't watching. That was 6 months ago. She's had a lot of time to think about it since then. So have I. My name is Raymond Calloway. I'm 68 years old. I grew up on a farm outside of Terre Haute, Indiana, and I spent 31 years waking up at 5 in the morning to work land that my father's father broke with his hands before either of us existed. I'm not telling you that to impress you. I'm telling you so you understand who you're dealing with. I drive a 2009 Ford F-150 with a crack in the windshield I've been meaning to fix since 2021. I buy my shirts at Walmart, 2 for $12, and I see no reason to apologize for that. My watch is a Casio I bought at a gas station in 2014. Still keeps perfect time. I call every soft drink Coke, regardless of brand, and I've been told this is annoying, and I've decided I don't care. My wife Carol passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I still make 2 cups of coffee every morning. I pour one out. Old habit. I don't think I'll break it. After Carol died, my son Daniel suggested I move up to Columbus to be closer to family. I thought it was a good idea at the time. I still think it was a good idea. I just had some information Daniel didn't have about what closer to family was going to mean in practice. Daniel is a good man. I want to be clear about that. He's a good man who sometimes makes the mistake of thinking that staying quiet is the same thing as staying neutral. He learned that from me, honestly. I spent 30 years not correcting people who underestimated me because it was easier and usually more useful to let them keep doing it. He'll understand what I mean by that eventually. We'll get to that part. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on Morse Road in November. I planted tomatoes on the balcony that spring, the same variety Carol used to grow, Brandywines, because they're ugly and they taste like something. All the pretty tomatoes taste like nothing. I've always thought that was a useful thing to remember. I kept my schedule from Indiana as close as I could. Up at 5, coffee, walk 2 miles, breakfast, then whatever the day needed. On Sundays, I had dinner at Daniel and Melissa's house. That was the arrangement. Daniel would pick me up at 4, we'd eat by 6, I'd be home by 8:30. It worked fine for about 3 months. I should tell you about Melissa. Melissa is 34 years old. She runs a company called Elevate Image Consulting, which helps small businesses with branding and social media presence. She is very good at her job, from what I understand. She drives a white BMW she refers to as the car, like there's only one in the world. She has opinions about restaurants, about neighborhoods, about the correct way to pronounce certain words. She's the kind of person who notices what other people are wearing before she notices what they're saying. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it matters later. We were never close, Melissa and I. That was fine. I wasn't looking for a best friend. I was looking for a quiet chair and a good meal once a week. For the first few months, that's mostly what I got. I noticed things, though. The way she'd redirect the conversation when I started a sentence. The way she'd glance at her friends when I mispronounced something or asked a question she thought I should know the answer to. Small things. Individually, nothing. The kind of thing a reasonable person talks himself out of noticing. I'm a reasonable person. I talked myself out of it for a while, but I grew up reading land, reading weather, reading the difference between soil that looks fine and soil that's already failing underneath. You learn, after enough years, that small signs are how big things announce themselves before they arrive. I kept watching. If you're new here, this channel is called Elderly Vengeance. Every story on this channel is told by someone who got underestimated, not the loud kind of underestimated, where someone screams in your face, the quiet kind, the kind where someone looks right through you and makes a decision about who you are based on your truck, your accent, your shoes, the fork you picked up at dinner, and then finds out they were wrong. If that sounds like something you want to watch, subscribe. It's free. And it's the only way to make sure you don't miss how this one ends. Because it ends in a way Melissa did not see coming. I promise you that. The dinner party was Melissa's idea, which meant it was Melissa's production. Third Saturday in April, 14 people. The kind of evening where everything on the table costs more than my monthly grocery bill, and nobody talks about anything that actually happened to them. I'd been to 2 of these before. I knew what they were. I went anyway because Daniel asked me to, and because I'd raised him to understand that showing up matters even when you don't want to. I wore my blue shirt. The good one, meaning the one without any stains. I drove myself because I didn't want to need a ride home if the evening went the way I thought it might. Melissa met me at the door. She was wearing something white and structured that I could tell cost a significant amount of money. She smiled the smile she uses for guests and said she was glad I could make it, and I said thank you for having me, and we both understood the transaction for what it was. The other guests were mostly people from Melissa's world, a couple who ran a marketing firm in the short north, a woman named Priya who did something in commercial real estate that she explained twice, and I still didn't fully follow. 2 men from Melissa's professional network who shook hands the way people do when they're deciding whether you're worth knowing. And a few people I recognized from previous dinners who nodded at me the way you nod at furniture you've seen before. I found a chair near the end of the table and sat down. Daniel was at the other end, talking to the marketing couple. He caught my eye and raised his glass. I raised mine. That was the extent of our conversation for the first 40 minutes. I was fine with that. I had my food, and I had my water, and I had a clear view of the room. That's usually enough. The first thing was the wine. Someone asked me what I thought of the Burgundy they were serving. I said it tasted like wine to me, which was the truth, and which produced a small pause at that end of the table before the conversation moved on without me. Melissa, 3 seats away, smiled at her plate. The second thing was the question about travel. The woman named Priya asked if I'd done much traveling, the way people ask it when they're expecting a list of European cities. I told her Carol and I drove to every state in the continental U.S. between 1998 and 2011. Took us 13 years, 1 or 2 states at a time. We saw things most people who fly over the country never see. Priya said that sounded charming. The way she said it closed the subject. The third thing was the fork. It wasn't a dramatic moment. I picked up the wrong fork for the salad course. I didn't know it was wrong until I caught Melissa watching me with that particular stillness she has. The kind that means she's filing something away. I finished my salad. The fork worked fine. These three things happened over the course of maybe 25 minutes. Individually, nothing. Collectively, the groundwork for what came next. It happened during a gap in the conversation. Those moments exist at every dinner party. A few seconds where nobody is talking and everyone is reaching for something to say. Someone at the far end mentioned they were thinking about opening a second office location somewhere with lower overhead. I didn't say anything. I wasn't part of that conversation, but Melissa looked down the table at me and then back at her guests, and she said it with the lightness of someone who thought they were being charming. Real estate is a whole different world depending on where you're from. Raymond grew up farming in Indiana, so all of this is pretty new territory for him. She smiled when she said it. The table produced polite sounds. A few people glanced at me the way you glance at something that's been explained. That was it. That was the whole thing. No shouting. No visible cruelty. Just a woman using 12 words to take a person apart and reassemble him as something smaller. Something that didn't need to be included in the conversation anymore. Something that could be smiled at and moved past. I kept my face the way I keep my face. Steady. I took a sip of water. I set the glass down. Daniel was at the other end of the table. I didn't look at him, but I knew he heard it because the table isn't that long, and my son is not a man who misses things. He just sometimes decides that the cost of responding to a thing is higher than the cost of letting it pass. I understood that. I taught him that in a way, without meaning to. The conversation moved on. Melissa refilled someone's wine. The evening continued for another 2 hours, pleasant and well catered and exactly what it was designed to be. I drove home at 8:45, took the long way. The city looks different at night when you're not in a hurry to get anywhere. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call anyone. I just drove, and I thought the way I've thought about difficult things my whole life. Slowly and without rushing toward a conclusion. By the time I got home, I had a question I needed to answer. It wasn't an angry question. It was a practical one. I went inside and made a cup of tea. Then I went to find a file I hadn't opened in about 8 months. I want to stop here for a second. If you've made it this far, you already know this story doesn't end at that dinner table. You can probably feel where it's going, even if you don't know the specifics yet. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't. Not because I'm asking nicely. Because there are 40 more stories here exactly like this one. And every single one of them ends with someone finding out that the person they wrote off had been paying attention the whole time. The button's right there, now. The file. The file was in the second drawer of my desk, behind my tax returns and a folder of Carol's medical records I haven't been able to throw away yet. Manila envelope. Nothing written on the outside. I've never needed to label it because I've always known exactly where it is and exactly what's in it. I sat down at the kitchen table with my tea and I opened it. Inside, a summary sheet my property manager sends me every January. 1 page, clean columns, property address, tenant name, lease term, monthly rate, renewal status. I don't own a lot. I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to tell you I'm secretly a real estate mogul, because that's not true, and that's not the point. What I own is the result of 31 years of farming, of buying the first property in 1987 with money I saved over 14 years of getting up before dawn, of making careful decisions slowly and without fanfare, and reinvesting when it made sense and not when it didn't. 7 properties total, 4 residential, 3 commercial, all within 40 miles of Columbus. Nothing flashy. Everything maintained. I ran my finger down the tenant column until I found what I was looking for. Elevate Image Consulting, LLC, Suite 204. A small office building on Henderson Road that I bought in 2019 from a man who needed to sell quickly and priced it accordingly. 3 suites. Good bones. Low maintenance. The kind of building that doesn't draw attention to itself. Which I've always considered a quality rather than a defect. Melissa's company had been in Suite 204 for 14 months. I sat with that for a while. I want to tell you what I didn't do, because I think it matters. I didn't call Daniel that night. I didn't call Melissa. I didn't call my property manager and tell him to do anything. I didn't make a single decision in the 48 hours after that dinner, because I've learned over 68 years that decisions made in the first 48 hours after you've been hurt are almost never the right ones. They're just fast, and fast is not the same as right. What I did was go to bed, got up at 5 the next morning, made my coffee, walked my 2 miles, came home and ate breakfast. Then I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about Carol. Carol was smarter than me about most things. She had a way of asking one question that rearranged everything. When I'd come in from the field frustrated, jaw tight, ready to make a phone call I'd regret, she'd look at me over whatever she was doing and say, "What are you actually trying to accomplish?" Not sarcastically, genuinely, because she knew that half the time I didn't know the answer, and that until I knew the answer, any action I took was just motions. So I asked myself the question, what are you actually trying to accomplish, Raymond? Not, how do you make her feel what you felt at that table? Not, how do you prove something? Not, how do you win? What are you actually trying to accomplish? I sat with it for 3 days. By the 3rd day, I had an answer that felt honest and didn't have any anger left in it, which is how I know an answer is ready. On Wednesday morning, I called Gary. Gary Pittman has been managing my properties for 11 years. He's efficient, and he doesn't ask unnecessary questions, which are the 2 qualities I value most in a professional relationship. When I call, he picks up. When I ask for something reasonable, he does it without drama. I asked him to pull the lease for Suite 204 on Henderson. He pulled it while I waited. 14 months in on an 18-month term. 4 months left. I asked him what the renewal process looked like. He explained it. Standard 30-day notice to the tenant before the term ends, offering renewal at current or adjusted rate. If I chose not to renew, 60-day written notice was required by the lease terms, giving the tenant time to find alternative space. I thanked him and told him I'd be in touch before the notice deadline. And he said no problem, and we hung up. The whole call took 6 minutes. I wrote the lease end date on a piece of paper and put it on my desk where I could see it. Then I went and watered my tomatoes. 2 Sundays later, I went to Daniel's for dinner as usual. Melissa was warm in the way she is when it's just family, which is a different warmth than the kind she produces for guests. But I wasn't measuring warmth. I was watching other things. Halfway through dinner, Daniel asked me how I was settling in, whether I needed anything. I said I was fine. I said the tomatoes were coming along. He nodded and changed the subject. The way he does when he's relieved a conversation didn't go somewhere he was afraid it might go. I didn't bring up the dinner party. Neither did he. I thought about Carol's question again, sitting at that table. What are you actually trying to accomplish? And I thought about the answer I'd arrived at, and I thought about whether Daniel was part of it. By the time dessert came, I decided he was. Not as a target, as a lesson. There's a difference. I needed him to understand the difference, too, eventually, but that part wasn't ready yet. So I finished my pie and talked about the weather and drove home at the usual time. 4 months is a long time to sit with something. Most people can't do it. They need the release, the confrontation, the moment where they say what they've been holding. I understand that. I spent the first 30 years of my life that way, too. But Carol used to say patience isn't the same as passivity. Patience is what you do while you're getting ready. Passivity is what you do when you've stopped believing anything will change. I believed something would change. I just needed to do it right. The notice deadline was 6 weeks out. I called Gary on a Tuesday morning the same way I call him about any routine property matter, and I told him what I'd decided. He said he'd send the paperwork by end of week. I said that was fine. Then I drove to the garden center and bought a second Brandywine tomato plant, because the first one was doing well enough that it seemed like a good time to expand. Carol would have found that funny. I found it appropriate. The notice went out on a Friday. Standard letter, Gary's company letterhead. Formal language about lease termination, 60-day vacate timeline, move-out procedures. The kind of letter that looks like paperwork until you read it twice and understand what it actually means. I know it arrived on a Monday because that's when Daniel called me. I was in the middle of repotting one of the tomato plants when my phone rang. His name on the screen. 11:14 in the morning, which is not when Daniel usually calls. He calls on Sunday evenings, sometimes Saturday afternoons, never Tuesday mornings, never with that particular speed, like the call had been sitting in his hand for an hour before he finally made it. I set down the pot, washed my hands, answered. He said, "Dad," just that. One word, but with enough weight in it that I knew Melissa had already called him, and he'd already had that conversation, and now he was trying to figure out which version of this was true. I said, "Daniel." He asked me if I knew anything about the building on Henderson Road. I said I did. A pause. Not long. 3, 4 seconds. But a kind of pause that means someone is reorganizing what they thought they understood. He asked me how long. I told him I bought it in 2019. Another pause, longer this time. He asked me why I never said anything. I told him the same reason he never said anything at that dinner table in April. Because sometimes you make a decision that staying quiet is easier than explaining something to someone who isn't ready to hear it. He didn't respond to that right away. I let it sit. After a moment, he said, "Melissa is pretty upset." I said, I understood that. He said she needed that office, that moving was going to be expensive, that the timing was difficult, that she had clients who knew that address. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I asked him one question. I said, "Were you at that dinner in April?" Quiet. Not the pause of someone thinking, the quiet of someone who already knows what's coming and is deciding whether to walk toward it or away from it. He said, "Dad, that's not," I said, "I'm not asking you to defend anything. I'm asking you a yes or no question. Were you there?" He said yes. I said, "Okay." That was it. That was the whole conversation I needed to have with my son. Not an accusation, not a lecture. One question and one answer, and everything that needed to be said was inside it. He knew it too. I could hear it. After a few seconds, he asked me what he was supposed to tell Melissa. I told him that was between him and Melissa, and that I trusted him to handle it the way he thought was right. Same way I trusted him to handle things in April. He understood what I meant. I wasn't cruel about it, but I wasn't unclear about it either. We talked for another few minutes about nothing in particular. His work, my tomatoes, the kind of conversation that exists to let two people find their footing again after something shifts. Before he hung up, he said he'd talk to me Sunday. I said that sounded good. She called that afternoon. I'll give her credit for that. A lot of people wouldn't have. Her voice had the careful quality of someone who has practiced what they're about to say. Measured, professional, the same register she uses when she's managing a situation rather than living inside it. She said she'd received a notice from my property management company. I said I was aware. She said she wanted to understand if there was something she could do to resolve the situation. That word, resolve, like it was a billing dispute. I told her the lease terms were clear and the notice was proper, and that Gary would be the right person to contact if she had procedural questions. A beat. Then she said, "Raymond, is this about the dinner?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. I said, "Melissa, I've been making business decisions for 40 years based on what makes sense for my properties and my tenants. I'd encourage you not to look for a simpler explanation than that." She started to say something else. I could hear her organizing another approach. I said, "Gary's number is on the letterhead. He's very easy to work with. I hope the transition goes smoothly." And I ended the call. Not with anger, not with satisfaction exactly, with the particular calm of a man who has said the true thing and doesn't need to say anything else. Daniel came over that Sunday without Melissa. First time that had happened since I moved to Columbus. He showed up at 4, same as always, but alone, with a 6-pack of the cheap beer I actually like instead of the craft stuff Melissa buys. He sat down at my kitchen table and looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "I should have said something at the dinner." I poured us each a beer. I said, "Yes." He nodded. He wasn't looking for absolution. He was just saying the true thing, which is all I've ever asked of him. We sat there for a while. I told him about the first property I ever bought, a duplex in Terre Haute, 1987, $12,000. I'd saved it over 14 years, skipped every vacation Carol and I talked about taking, drove the same truck for 11 years past when I should have replaced it. He said he didn't know that. I said there were a lot of things he didn't know, and that was fine, but that the older I got, the less interested I was in being invisible to the people who were supposed to see me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I see you, Dad." I said, "I know you do. That's why we're sitting here." We watched the game. Neither of us said anything else about it. We didn't need to. I want to be honest with you about something. The moment people expect in a story like this is a confrontation, a room, two people. The reveal lands like a verdict, loud enough for everyone to hear. The person who underestimated you finally understands exactly how wrong they were, and you get to watch it happen. I've had moments like that in my life. They feel good for about 20 minutes. Then they feel like nothing. Then sometimes they feel like a mistake. What I had instead was a Tuesday morning phone call that lasted 4 minutes. A quiet question to my son that he answered honestly. A short conversation with a woman who called me embarrassing in front of 10 people and then called me 2 months later hoping I'd forgotten. No room, no audience, no verdict. Just paperwork and a phone call and a son sitting at my table with cheap beer telling me he sees me. That's the whole thing. I know it's not what you were picturing. I've found that the things that actually change something rarely are. Melissa found a new space 6 weeks later. I know the details because Gary handles enough commercial leases in that part of Columbus that information moves through his office the way weather moves through a valley. He didn't tell me as gossip. He mentioned it as a matter of professional courtesy, the way he'd mention anything relevant to the local market. The new space was smaller, a single suite in a building on Olentangy River Road, 3rd floor, no dedicated parking. Monthly rate 11% higher than what she'd been paying on Henderson. She signed an 18-month term because that was the shortest available, which means she committed to a number she didn't want for a duration she didn't choose. The move itself cost her roughly $4,000 when you account for movers, new signage, updated materials, and the 2 weeks she effectively lost to logistics instead of client work. 3 clients didn't follow her to the new address. I don't know the reasons. People have their own reasons. But a business like Melissa's runs on continuity and perceived stability. And neither of those things are easy to project from a half-empty floor on Olentangy while your business cards still say the old address. She never contacted me again after that phone call. Daniel told me months later that she'd figured out I'd owned the Henderson building before she signed her original lease, that she'd been a tenant of mine for 14 months without knowing it. He said she found that harder to process than the non-renewal itself. I understood that. There's something unsettling about discovering that the person you dismissed was already part of the infrastructure of your life before you decided who they were. 10 days after the vacate date, I drove back to Terre Haute. Not to hide from anything, not to escape. I just had some business to look at. An old contact who wanted advice on a property. And I figured while I was there, I'd spend a few days on the land. The farmhouse has been rented for 12 years to a family named Kowalski. Good tenants. They've painted the porch twice, added a vegetable garden along the south fence, kept the place better than I kept it the last 5 years Carol and I lived there. I pulled up the gravel drive and sat in the truck for a minute looking at it. It looked like a home. That's the right thing for a house to look like. I drove out to the back 40, where we used to grow soybeans. Nobody farms it now. The Kowalskis don't need it, and I haven't decided what to do with it. It just sits there. Which land is good at? I parked and got out and walked it for a while. The soil in that part of Indiana has a particular smell in early summer, warm and specific. Like something that's been working for a long time and is in no hurry to stop. I've been to a lot of places. I've never smelled anything else quite like it. I stood there for probably 20 minutes, doing nothing except existing in a place that knew me before I knew myself. Carol would have made fun of me for being sentimental about dirt. She would have been right to. But she also would have been standing right next to me, so. When I got back to Columbus, I had Sunday dinner at Daniel's. Melissa was there. She was polite. I was polite. We talked about nothing in particular, which is a skill both of us have, and we will probably continue to use it for as long as we find ourselves at the same table. I don't hate her. I want to be clear about that. Hate is a full-time job, and I'm retired. What I think about Melissa, when I think about her at all, is that she's very good at reading rooms and very poor at reading people. Those two things can look like the same skill for a long time before they reveal themselves as opposites. She looked at me and saw a man who didn't know which fork to use. She wasn't wrong about the fork. She was wrong about what the fork meant. That's a common mistake. I've spent most of my adult life allowing people to make it, mostly because correcting them wasn't worth the effort, occasionally because it was useful to let them keep going. This was one of the occasional times. I don't regret it. I also don't feel what I expected to feel, which was something large and satisfying, a closing of accounts, a weight lifted. What I feel instead is something quieter and more durable. The feeling of having done a thing correctly after thinking about it long enough to be sure. Carol used to call it clean. She said some decisions just feel clean afterward, like you cut something straight rather than tearing it. I think that's right. This one felt clean. I'm still on Morse Road, still driving the F-150 with the cracked windshield, which I have now officially decided I'm never going to fix. Still growing brandywines on the balcony, still making 2 cups of coffee every morning. The second cup still gets poured out. Still not breaking that habit. Daniel comes over on Sundays sometimes, just him with the cheap beer, and we watch whatever's on and don't talk about anything that needs talking about. Those are good evenings. I've decided they're enough. I've been called a lot of things over 68 years. Farmer, widower, father, landlord. Embarrassing, apparently, at a dinner party in April. Most of those names came from people who thought knowing one fact about me was the same as knowing me, who saw the truck and the Walmart shirt and the wrong fork and made a decision that felt safe and complete and required no further investigation. I've never corrected any of them out loud. I've just kept going about my business, and my business, as it turns out, has always been in better shape than anyone standing in my kitchen thought to ask about. That's Raymond's story. If it stayed with you, there's a reason for that. The people who watch this channel aren't here for the revenge. They're here because they recognize something. A dinner table, a tone of voice, a room full of people who looked through someone they should have looked at. If you recognize something in this one, subscribe. Every story on this channel is told by someone who kept quiet long enough, thought carefully enough, and then acted exactly right. Raymond's just one of them. There are more, and they're all waiting.